slavery was not invented by white people. The truth is that Africans were sold into slavery by other black Africans.
Level 1. If North America fell to shit and the Canadians and Mexicans came and invaded us and then the Mexicans sold us off to some British people for slaves, would you say that Americans sold other Americans to slavery? Well, that might be a technically correct statement. You don't think of it that way, do you? You know it's more complicated than that. In the same way Canadians wouldn't think that they're selling themselves into slavery if they sold Americans. Africans didn't view it that way either. Just because we consider them one race because they're all black by today's standards, does that mean that they considered themselves one people back in the day?
And in many cases, sold for items as trivial as gin and mirrors.
Wow.
Level 2, peep the rhetorical strategy when she says they were sold for things as trivial as gin and mirrors. You can tell the rhetorical strategy worked because...
I just can't believe I hate me. He sold the niggas for some alcohol and mirrors.
Funnily enough, they didn't tell you anything else that was traded for two main reasons. One, because PragerU wants to paint the picture, look at these dumb black Africans, they just traded themselves for gin and mirrors. And two, when we look at the exhaustive list of things that different African nations received in return, it makes it look like there was almost a profit incentive that differed the slavery that was already taking place in Africa from the transatlantic slave trade that saw increased demands from Europeans, which exploded the amount of slavery. That increased demand creating a lot of revenue for African nations, which is why they helped the Europeans. And if Europeans ran into any sort of problems while trying to obtain their slaves, they formed allyships with other African governments and funded them with weapons and means to attack other African nations in return for slaves. I thought no one stood guiltless, but you seem to be omitting a key piece of information in order to make it seem like white people stood guiltless.
The stark reality is that our lives had very little value to our ancestors.
That's not how ancestors work. A lot of slaves in America came from the west coast of Africa, but we don't know who traded us necessarily, nor if we're related to them. However, there are a few hundred years of slaves being in America for some reason, then giving birth to children who then automatically became slaves for some reason. Pretty sure they valued their lives and their offspring's lives.
If you think slavery is a relic of the past, you're wrong. There are some 700,000 slaves in Africa today. That's almost twice as many slaves as were ever brought to the United States.
Hey, let's play some math fuckery and bring up the fact that 450,000 Africans arrived in the United States without realizing, they had kids who were also slaves. Estimates putting the total amount of slaves in America coming up to around 10 million. And that count stops in 1865. Those slaves producing billions of hours of labor for no money.
African bodies are being sold today like they were sold then. And no, they are not being purchased by any country of white men. In fact, slavery, by any traditional definition, is exclusively practiced today within non-white countries.
Yeah, they exist in Africa with an estimated 7 million men, women, and children living in current-day slavery. It exists here too, with an estimated 1.1 million men, women, and children living in modern-day slavery in the United States. I thought no one stood guiltless, but you seem to be only mentioning one part of the world that has slave-like conditions still, without mentioning the literal fucking rest of the world that also has slave-like conditions. I thought you said no one stood guiltless, but then you said...
In fact, slavery, by any traditional definition, is exclusively practiced today within non-white countries.
Which is quite literally a fucking lie. We just went over it.
If we embrace the patriotic spirit that is our real heritage, then the race hustlers would soon be out of business.
Yes, the race hustlers aren't the ones who are comically wrong about literally everything having to do with history and black people and anything having to do with slavery in order to continue a culture war debate bullshit about the real stance of black people and how we really got here in order to make money from a network funded by fossil fuel billionaires in order to push a conservative worldview. No, it's the people who are literally correct. But conservatives literally have no policy position to help black people, or anybody from that matter, which is why they have to keep gaslighting you into believing things that you know to be a fact aren't actually true and they're up for debate, whilst lying and hoping that you will never look it up. And it looks like they were fucking right. If you're gonna spread bullshit propaganda, try harder. Fuck out of here.